From the Gospel of John. Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Today is the last Sunday of the worship year. Next week, we begin with the first Sunday of Advent, and it all starts over again as we head toward Christmas. In 1925, Pope Pius XI decided to designate this Sunday by the name Christ the King. He was worried that Christians were getting too cozy with the secular kingdoms of this world and losing their loyalty to the true King of glory. Imagine that. If that was true nearly a century ago, how much more so today, when we seem to be having so much trouble getting free from our political allegiances to understand how Christ is our true King. But that isn't just a modern problem. This is precisely what was going on in Jesus' own time on earth. And our text today zeroes in on a moment when Jesus tried to make it clear how he was a king like none other that anyone had ever known, let alone any president or prime minister. And the difference is everything, I tell you. Everything. Always has been, always will be. Jesus is in the final week of his life. He's had his halcyon days up in Nazareth with those fragrant flowers, we were just singing about, where he was exciting the masses by his wisdom. He was healing the sick. He was exorcising demons. He made ordinary Jews thrilled at the prospect that he could be the Messiah who would at long last deliver them from the oppression of the Romans and restore the kingdom to Israel. Now that made two other groups of Jews nervous. Pharisees, who held sway over the everyday life of the Jews, and temple priests, who had made an accommodation with Roman authorities to leave them in control of Jewish worship. In theory, they all wanted the same thing. That is, a Messiah who would come and would restore sovereignty to the Jewish people. But their fear of being wrong was also warranted. If they set their hopes on Jesus and they were wrong, Rome would punish them ruthlessly. They were right about that. From the years 66 to 73 CE, a group of Jews revolted against Rome and were crushed by the massive forces of the empire. The temple was destroyed, Jews had to flee Jerusalem, and the last stand of the rebels was at a place called Masada, a glorious mountain retreat, a palace of King Herod, a fortress overlooking the Dead Sea, where Jewish revolutionaries had their last stand, their Alamo, you might say. And it was there that they made the decision that they would actually take each other's lives, killing each other's wives and children and husbands, rather than letting those dirty Gentile Roman soldiers killed him instead. Well, Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Jewish leaders had turned him over to Pilate as a criminal. They were looking out for themselves, but their own law prevented them from taking his life. So they let Pilate do the dirty work, technically letting themselves off the hook. Pilate, however, is not interested in whether Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He is only interested in the one thing he understands, and that's kingship. Are you the king of the Jews? Because Pilate's charge was to put down any insurrection against Rome, and anyone claiming to be king would have been a threat. Are you the king of the Jews? He asked Jesus. And Jesus asks him, so who wants to know, basically? Are you interested in this, or did somebody put you up to it, is what he's saying. Pilate says, I am not a Jew. Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. Now, this is where we have to pause and say something important. Some of us were just in Israel, as you just heard, and there was a Jewish man in our group who was pretty anxious about being with so many Christians, even though he's married to one. He grew up in upstate New York, among a lot of Italian Catholics who were his childhood peers. And they no doubt parroted their parents and priests, and it still rings in his ears that they called him Mora Cristo, which means Christ killer. For centuries, Christians have indicted the Jews for killing Christ. So-called Christian kings justified Jewish genocide by saying that the Jews killed their Savior. Of course, the weird thing about that is that it's only by his death that we are saved anyway. But our friend wanted to know if we thought that as a Jew, he was a Christ killer. The answer is emphatically no. Only the Romans could have and did carry out his execution. But having said that, we should just as quickly say that yes, a particular group of Jews did conspire to have Jesus killed, even if it was the Romans who carried out the execution. It wasn't Jews, though, as Jews, or Romans as Romans who killed Jesus. It was Jews and Romans as human beings who did him in. As human beings who were more aligned with the ways of the kingdoms of this world than with the kingdom of heaven. Which is to say, any of us who prefer or defend the ways of the kingdoms of this world as opposed to Christ's kingdom are guilty of his death. In other words, all of us, to one degree or another, are so charged. My kingdom is not from this world, Jesus says. Not from here. What does he mean by that? Where are you from? It's a common question we ask, right? It's one of the first things people ask when getting to know each other, and it's usually not a compliment when someone says, you must not be from here. Especially in Texas, right? My son always likes to correct me when he hears me answer a question like that by saying, I'm from New York. I think this is legitimate. I'm going back to my origins, right? But my son says, Dad, you've lived 35 of the last 39 years in Dallas, which is more than half my life. He says, you're from Texas. I said, tell Texans that, you know. Now, I don't quite feel like Browning Ware about this, right? Browning was the longtime pastor of the First Baptist Church of Austin, and he had a cabin in Colorado. Browning liked to say that he went to bed in Texas but he fell asleep in Colorado. Not Oklahoma, in Colorado, right? I like to say that I'm at home in Dallas, but I'm never visiting when I go back to New York, because I confess to maintaining a New York state of mind, don't you know? Still, where you say you come from matters in the sense that it betrays something of the values that you carry with you, the way you look at the world. There's a T-shirt company called Home Tea that actually makes T-shirts now with the silhouette of your state on the front, and inside it, it just says home, right? So if Jesus had one of those T-shirts on as he stood in front of Pilate, what shape do you think his home state would be on the front of his T-shirt? And if you say the state of Palestine, you would miss Jesus' point altogether. Jesus' kingdom, his kingship, is not of this world. Now, here's the big however. When most of us hear that, we immediately misunderstand him. We think he means, thank God, would you tell my preacher Jesus is not interested in politics. Jesus only cares, we think, about your heart. We think he's telling us that true religion is a spiritual matter of getting right with God so that when we die, we will go to the true kingdom eternally, the kingdom of heaven. And by that logic, the Jews and Romans made a terrible mistake because Jesus was really no threat at all to the powers of this world and still isn't. He was a mystic who only cared about the life to come. There's no indication that's what he meant here. Notice what he says, if my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Jesus' kingship, in other words, does not operate under the same values as the kingdoms of this world. It does not fight with the weapons of the world. It doesn't use the means of the kingdoms of this world to secure itself. Every empire employs violence to protect itself against others and keep its position of power and privilege. It is willing to kill people it sees as threats. It is willing to scapegoat others in order to retain power. And we've seen an example of that recently with the killing of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi was a critic of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. All evidence points to the Crown Prince's ordering of the assassination of Khashoggi. And since his murder, the Saudis have come up with one story after another, somehow to justify what happened and to claim someone else is responsible. And in order to appease world opinion, the prince has arrested and ordered the execution of 5 operatives as scapegoats, denying the truth of his own treachery. And because of our country's alliance with him, and the billions of dollars in weapons sales that are at stake, and because it provides access to low-priced oil, we're going to let him off the hook, it looks like. The kingdoms of this world, people. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, and it's not a partisan matter. Consider what story you saw on the front page of the Dallas Morning News today, recounting that during George W. Bush's administration, the continent of Africa was saved in ways that we can hardly imagine by the commitment of the Bush administration to address the HIV/AIDS problem in Africa. George W. Bush claimed that rich countries have a moral obligation to third world and developing countries, that if we have access to things that will provide cures, that they should too. And there's no telling in history what will be the consequences of that act of generosity. Or compare to what happened in Denmark during World War II. Hitler had been scapegoating the Jews all over Europe, and he had installed a puppet government in Denmark. A Swedish newspaper produced a cartoon depicting King Christian X talking with the former Danish prime minister, who asks him, "What are we going to do, Your Majesty, if they make all the Jews in our country wear the yellow star of David?" The king responds by saying, "Then we'll all have to wear yellow stars." When we visited the Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem a few weeks ago, we walked through the room that honored the righteous Gentiles of the nations who saved Jews during the war. And it's estimated that 7,000 Jews were in Denmark. And nearly all of them were rescued by the Danes, secretly shipped off in a deal negotiated privately by the king with Sweden. And they put them on private boats and ships and sent them across the channel to be saved. Because the king protected his people, all of them. Jesus' kingdom operates just that way and wants the kingdoms of this world to operate just that way. The kingdom of Christ is a kingdom of love and mercy, a kingdom where every person is treated with dignity and value and is respected no matter who they are or where they are from. His kingdom not being from here means it does not conform to the ways of earthly kingdoms, but demands that earthly kingdoms conform to his. Jesus says he came to testify to the truth, and that those who belong to the truth listen to his voice. Jesus is saying to Pilate what he had said to his disciples, namely that he himself is the truth, embodies it. He is the shepherd king that lays down his life for the sheep. His sheep know his voice and follow him. He is the good shepherd who does not act to save his own skin first. He lays down his life, and he goes to find every lost sheep and to bring them safely home. The contrast then is between selfish, self-seeking ways of living and selfless, other-seeking ways of living. When we look after our own interests first and see other people as different from us and unworthy of our love and care, we have done exactly what Pope Pius XI feared. We have given over our loyalty to secular kingdoms and lost our moral compass. Martin Luther King Jr. put it this way: every person must decide whether they will walk in the light of creative altruism or the darkness of destructive selfishness. This is the judgment. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Jesus doesn't privilege any version of the truth that sidesteps humility, surrender, and sacrificial love. He doesn't secure his own prosperity at the expense of other people's suffering. He doesn't allow holy ends to justify debased means. He doesn't make honesty optional when the truth strikes him as inconvenient. And he never aligns himself with brute, dishonest power to guarantee his own success. This is our King. If we are subjects of King Jesus, this is how we must live too. We have to be committed to his true way of life. When the kingdoms of this world try to seduce us into following in their way, we must resist and follow the voice of the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. Not being from here is the only way of truly being here with King Jesus. Amen.